So, most of us, whether we really realize it or not, we got a picture of what we'd like to be like, what we want to fight for and work towards and eventually become. For some, for many bodybuilders, Arnold Schwarzenegger was sort of the peak of physique, at least at one point in his life. Age has come for him too. Today people make an awful decent living, or some people, by being online influencers. Influencers are more or less the people that have become famous online, social media or whatever, and they use their fame to sell products or to sell advertisements and generate revenue that way. Influencers are people that other people online want to be like, and so they'll copy them to get their whatever products they're selling or ideas or books. But there's a very influential goal that people through all ages, long before social media, have aimed for, have fought for. They've even broken laws for it, violated the rights of others for it. In a word, it's wealth. Jesus had a whole lot to say about money and its role and its place in our lives. And James, the leader of the early church, continues that discussion in his letter to the early church. This week, we're going to be beginning the very last chapter of the book of James, James chapter 5. And if you're just joining us, James has been called the Proverbs of the New Testament. It has a lot to say about a number of topics in life. And the better we get them and better we get at them, the better off we are. James says a lot about a lot of different topics, and a couple of them we've seen come back to the surface multiple times. Things like controlling what comes out of our mouth, taming the tongue, or matching our beliefs with our actions. Our faith isn't just something we simply privately hold and personal. It's something that if we truly live, it affects our behavior and our choices. But there's another topic that has come up a few times, and it's around the subject of money. James sometimes has a way of being fairly blunt. And this is another one of those times. And I'm drawn to sort of soften the blow, but I don't think I want to stand before God and explain why I didn't present his material the way he wrote it. So buckle up a little. Next week will be more uplifting. You can read ahead. Earlier, we saw that when it comes to money, we're not supposed to treat anybody with preference because they had more money, or treat anyone with less dignity because they had less. All of them are made in the image of God, and they should all be treated with the same dignity and respect inside the church. The same respect that God affords them. A soul is a soul is a soul. But last week we saw James give some strong instructions to our Christian brethren, especially those in business. Among others, James wants us to mind our boastful arrogance, especially when it comes to our future plans. And in last week, he started off with sort of a rhetorical rebuke that kind of slips past us, but was a bit of a catchphrase in his time. Come now. In that time, that phrase was often used before a kind of rebuke. So they kind of knew something was coming. The first one appears to be Christians conducting business and sort of leaving God out of their plans, presuming on the future instead of entrusting their futures to God and seeking his will. This week continues his rebuke with another rhetorical, come now. And this time it appears he's directing it more broadly to wealthy in general. That includes both those inside and outside the church. Let's read together in James chapter 5, verse 1. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. This would kind of be the opposite of what you'd expect, no? Usually we consider those without money to be heading into trouble. That's often the practical reality that we see. I got to looking, according to a survey conducted by payroll.com back in 23, so just last year, approximately 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. That means that at the end of the month, the money they've earned and the money they spent is more or less equivalent, and they've got no more to save or invest or plan for down the road. And that has kind of left 28% of Americans, or one in four basically, with no savings or savings below $1,000. That's not just a simple bank account savings. That's like all savings available to them. Savings accounts, emergency funds, non-retirement investments. Less than $1,000 to their name. Now, the why of why this is the way is not really our topic for today. But we do see many people struggling financially. And you would think these are the people that need to get ready for some trouble ahead. They need to have an emergency fund. They need to be ready for the pain that's coming towards them. And in some cases, that's fairly true, right? We see unexpected expenses come, and that's difficult. And there is a growing disparity, a growing problem with a shrinking middle class and real wage stagnation that began sometime in the 80s. And it appears to be putting outside pressure on people. You can put it on individual choices, and perhaps, and sure, there's choices that can be made that are better. But in addition to personal choices, there does seem to be an outside pressure these days that's making it a little bit harder than it was for previous generations to get ahead, financially at least. Jump online and check out rent prices if you haven't recently. It may drop your jaw. Where did these problems come from? Why do we have a population of Americans where nearly 8 out of 10 people are living paycheck to paycheck, and a quarter of them couldn't spring for a $1,000 expense? We'll leave that up to the financial economists and experts to hash out, but I can guarantee you that there's at least one ingredient: greed. And you might say the solution is simply to get people out of this financial situation. And I think in general it would be a good thing if people were able to have more margin in their budget and savings for emergencies and expenses, of course. And while there are real pressing dangers for those whose financials are stretched so thin they could kind of snap at the slightest unexpected weight put on them, James isn't telling them to weep and howl. He's not preaching to the people who don't have much to get better at managing their finances. No, he's talking to the rich, to the people who appear to be managing their finances quite well. It's not the poor or middle class he warns. It's the rich he tells to weep and howl. He tells those with great amounts of resources to watch out for miseries that are coming for them. And there's no emergency fund that can save them from them. Many scholars observe that this opening is very similar to the Old Testament prophets who were warning people of bad things coming their way. Weep and howl. Get ready. Weeping and howling is what you do when you're in the middle of miseries or after they've taken place. But these miseries are as sure as if they had already happened to come. I would guess that for most people throughout history, they idolize the wealthy. They want to achieve what they have. They want to live their lives and have the freedoms and resources that they have. One of the great ironies, though, is that it's often a relative thing, too. It's a constantly moving target. Wealth is not some objective standard. It's usually subjective and relative. Oftentimes, it's relative to those around us, what we see, or what our neighbors have or don't have. So much so that there's an old phrase that has really become a catchphrase for this sentiment: keeping up with the Joneses. Now, we have a set of Joneses in our church, not them. They're wonderful. Do you know there's a couple different theories of where that catchphrase came up? One of them is there's an old cartoon, like in the newspapers, that was called Keeping Up with the Joneses, where it was about this one couple constantly comparing and trying to keep up with the Joneses, who are never in the cartoon. They're just kind of behind the scenes. But there's another explanation, that before this comic strip, there was a wealthy and prominent family in New York in the mid-1800s. that appear to have gotten into kind of a competition with other wealthy families in the New York area building houses or villas. The Joneses and other rich New Yorkers began to build better and better villas to try and outdo each other. In 1853, Elizabeth Jones built a 24-room Gothic villa called Windcliff. Here's a picture of it. The villa appears to have been spurred than this one after they built this one. Other neighbors would build more and better and bigger and different. And this is a good possibility. This is where the phrase keeping up with the Joneses came from New York in the 1800s or mid 1800s. Eventually, the Joneses' worth, here's another angle of it from the back. Eventually, the Joneses' wealth would be eclipsed by other families, and the Joneses would sort of be swallowed up, and we don't hear their name anymore, other than this nifty catchphrase. But the phrase or the idea that it represents touched on something very common to many ages. In fact, James talked about it last chapter when he was talking about what causes quarrels. The source of many quarrels is coveting what other people have that we don't. There's a term for it nowadays in economics called conspicuous consumption. So when people care about their standard of living and its appearance in relation to their peers, it fuels a demand for status goods, goods that are desired because they distinguish you relative to others in social society or in standing. People don't buy a Rolex watch because they want to know the time. $10 at Walmart and you're set. People buy a Rolex because of what it represents. It's a social status. But for all the worldly comfort that money appears to afford, James says to those with wealth, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Come now. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. One of the things that as Christians we should always be mindful of is that life is temporary. It will end, and we will have to give an account to God for our choices in life. How we used what God gave us, we have to stand before Him and give an account. Most of the time, when we talk about the misuse of money, we're often directing our thoughts to the poor without and how they need to earn more or spend less or manage things this way or that. Some things that's awfully easy to say, especially when it's not our situation we find ourselves in. But there's another way to misuse money, and that's not to use it, to hoard it, to store it up. Wealthy people have temptations and dangers as much, if not more, than people without much money, spiritually, at least. The spiritual dangers of wealth, they're real and really dangerous. One of the dangers is to mix up our priorities and what money is and for, simply to hoard it for what idol it represents to us. The irony is that wealth hoarded is usually used to save us from troubles in the future. And Scripture isn't against being prudent and saving and managing money well and having an emergency fund, etc. Good things. But at some point, our savings are no longer doing that. Instead, they're setting on the sidelines, not being put into play as it ought to be. And as they're sitting on the sidelines, they're rotting. And as our wealth rots, that rot becomes testimony or evidence against us that we did not use our resources in a godly way. Do you know that Windcliff Villa is still around? At least to some degree. I found a drone footage video of it that I want to show you guys. Here's the current modern day Jones's house. That's it there, guys. Keeping up with the Joneses. That's what the end of the road looks like when you get there. All the resources that were spent in pursuing outdoing the neighbor is quite literally rotting where it stands. This is the end of the road. This is the fact at the end for all of our worldly wealth. It's going to end up like this, one way or another. Our goal as godly stewards, it's not simply to gather as much as possible before we die. And it's also not simply to live in poverty either. We've got to manage whatever God gives us in humility and faithfulness, as though it belongs to Him and not us. Because if we get to the end of our lives and all of our wealth is spent keeping up with the Joneses, our wealth will stand like Wycliffe as evidence against us. Evidence that we mismanaged, that we wasted the resources that we were given to steward over. Laying up treasures in the last days, saving wealth in the last era of human history, right before it's all lost. We make this mistake when we look at wealth from a purely worldly point of view. And we sort of leave out of our mind Judgment Day, out of our thinking, that final accounting before God. James' warning is pretty stark. Weep, howl for the miseries that are coming. But you know, it can get even worse. Oftentimes, the wealthy grow their wealth not by good business practices, but by cheating and defrauding people. In James 4, he goes on, "Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, they're crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." The rot of the Joneses' wealth, it's bad enough on its own. Now imagine if that house or that home was built on the backs of defrauded people. One of the real dangers for those with wealth, it's arrogance and pride. And it's arrogance and pride that allows us to disassociate ourselves with the plight of those who we have influence over. One of the shortcuts to wealth, it's cheating. Cheating those who have no power to defend themselves. And it works more often than we like to admit. Most of the production value in the first century was through growing food. So if you own land, you kind of owned the means of production. And one of the grave and real dangers for anyone in that position is to abuse their power for self-interest. If you think you would never do that in that situation, you might also be arrogant to presume that you would be immune to the temptations that are common to man. History is littered with people who have abused their power by taking advantage of the powerless under them. On some extreme examples, we've got some names and some faces. You might recognize many of these people. Bernie Madoff, Jeffrey Epstein, Elizabeth Holmes, Alan Stanford, Raj Ratnam. All these people cheated or abused their positions of power to a significant degree. And these are just some of them that have been caught. There's probably more. There's probably more that have not yet faced an accounting. Now, it's a complex issue, and it's not good to oversimplify. But we are seeing a stark contrast growing in the US. This is a Pew Research study that was conducted for the year of 2018. So things have not gotten any better, if you haven't guessed, between 2018 and now. US wealth is going up, but the middle class is dramatically shrinking. The wealth is going somewhere, but it's not being distributed evenly. How is that happening? I don't know. It's complex. But I'll bet you there's some greed involved. I'll bet you there's probably some abuse somewhere in there involved. And things have gotten kind of a good chunk worse in the last 5 or 6 years as far as inequality goes. Without various forms of injustices or cheating, I don't think it would have gotten quite as worse as it has. And it's naive to assume that it hasn't been a problem for generations, not a problem as old as sin. And it's not just an issue outside the church. We as Christians also fall prey to misusing the power of our positions. One clear example on that extreme side again is some that are proponents of the prosperity gospel. You may know some of these faces and some of these names: Kenneth Copeland, Creflo Dollar, Joel Osteen, Benny Hinn, Paula White, Kane. I believe that many of these people are intentional in their deceptions, but it's possible that some of them are simply deceived themselves. But many of these people and others have abused spiritual influence for financial gain as well. And boy, I don't want to be standing next to them on Judgment Day. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. It's bad enough when we mismanage what God has given to us, but Lord help us if we gain that wealth by injustice, if we acquired those riches by taking advantage of others. You have lived on earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person who does not resist you. These are extreme outcomes, but they point to the conclusion of where these abuses can often go. Would it be murder if fair wages were withheld that led to someone starving? And on the far end of the wealthy are those who are not only willing to murder to obtain their wealth and power, but they're in fact guilty of it. And I'm willing to bet that there's more that haven't been caught. This is a heavy passage. It's starting and jarring, but it needs to be. When we have a measure of financial safety and security and wealth, we can easily become insensitive to the greater spiritual realities governing our behavior. We don't see the immediate consequences of our choices, so we think there must not be any. I think it's important, again, to reiterate, there's no sin in merely having wealth. The sin exists when, along with riches, comes where the wealth was acquired. Is it earned by taking advantage of those disadvantaged who are also made in the image of God? It's sin when the Spirit in us leads us to tempt our hearts. Is it something that our self-worth is wrapped up, or our sense of superiority? Is it fueling a sense of pride? Or is it an additional responsibility that we have to give a transparent and holistic account to on the Judgment Day? And it can also be sin in the way that it's used. Our wealth is used, are we using it to keep up with the Joneses? Then just like their eroded house, our corroded gold and silver and rotted clothes, when Judgment Day comes, and what evidence do you have of this person's mismanagement? There are our riches rotting as testimony against us. That we didn't use them properly. We didn't employ them. We didn't deploy them. We didn't use them well. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as simply just giving up on money either. One of the things that makes it difficult for people who struggle with being addicted to eating is that they can't just stop eating. You die. You got to keep eating. If you want to quit smoking, you can just kind of stop that altogether. Granted, difficult, but you can live your whole life without smoking another cigarette. But if you want to lose weight, you got to learn to manage food in moderation. You got to eat, which means you got to deal with the temptation 2, 3, 4 times a day, at least. You can't simply stop it altogether and avoid it the rest of our lives. It's very similar with money. You can't just avoid it. You got to manage it and not let it manage you. And more of it is not necessarily better. More can even be more spiritually dangerous, as it has proved to be for countless souls over centuries. As Christians, we cannot idolize wealth and the wealthy as our goal. And if we are wealthy, we gotta be as serious as a heart attack about managing our resources in a godly way and not letting our handling of our resources stand ultimately as witness against us in Judgment Day. And Jesus said it's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. But he also said, with God, all things are possible. For the wealthy Christian, take very seriously the spiritual danger that wealth puts you in. Do as Jesus and James implore, humble yourself. Count on the day of judgment and budget accordingly. For those without worldly wealth, don't idolize them. Don't idolize the wealthy and make that the goal out of life. And please don't believe that somehow being wealthy is equated to being pleasing with God. The prosperity gospel is a putrid lie. Heavenly rewards have essentially no correlation with worldly riches. God will judge each of us according to what we were given and how we managed it. Each of us must manage what we've been given to the best of our ability as stewards of what is God's and not ours. And for those who abuse their power and wealth and seem to get away with it, God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. Judgment will come, and there will be nowhere to hide their abuse and fraud. And they will bear the full weight of their responsibility. Let's let that not be true of us. Let us escape by the mercy of God. And let us remember that money is and what it isn't. And let us live like we are in the last days. Pray with me. God, thank you for all the wonderful blessings that you have given us. Day in and day out, you are faithful to provide. And God, I thank you that you have continued to do so, even up until today. God, help us to see the worldly resources as they are, as Jesus tried to tell us, as James is warning us. Help us to use our worldly wealth in a way that testifies to your goodness in this life and in the next. It's in Jesus' name we pray.